everyone. My name is Michał Baranowski, and I'm a director of the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us on the other side of the screen, as well as having Andrea, David, and Jonathan with us. We are meeting just as President Biden is starting his first overseas trip that includes meeting at the G7 summit, the first NATO meeting of this presidency, a meeting between US and EU, and then at the end, a meeting between President Biden and Putin. There is, I must say that here in Warsaw, there is a fair amount of nervousness about this meeting. There is not a lot of love lost toward Putin, and many wonder whether this is the right moment and wonder about the agenda of the meeting. So we brought together really fantastic experts to discuss just these questions. But before we do that, let me pass on the mic or the screen to my colleague, Jonathan Katz, Senior Fellow at GMF, Washington.
Oh, thank you. And it's great to be here to have Washington, GMF, and Warsaw GMF together. You highlighted this is really one of the busiest weeks of diplomacy and with significant consequences for transatlantic relations, and obviously different perspectives, including on this meeting between President Biden and President Putin, which also has some in Washington with concerns or questions about the outcomes, the goals, what this means for U.S. engagement, security with transatlantic allies, particularly in Eastern Europe, including partners as well, like Ukraine. And so I think we couldn't have two better people today for this on the record conversation about this upcoming summit and this meeting. And I wanted to just thank Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who's here, who you introduced. And just by the way, I forgot to mention myself, I'm Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives at GMF. Sorry, Andrea. But I wanted to just bring you in. I know you're really busy. CNAS is in the middle of one of its busy weeks with its conference, annual conference right now. But I want to just give a little bit background of Andrea, who I really think, along with David, are two of the leading experts on U.S. Russia relations and many other issues as well. Andrea is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security, CNAS, works on national security challenges facing the United States and Europe, focused on Russia, authoritarianism, and threats to democracy and the state of the Transatlantic Alliance. I think this week, all these issues are going to be in play. And I know that you've been commenting a lot about many of these issues, but also specifically this meeting. But you also, prior to joining CNAS, you served for 8 years as a senior intelligence officer. For 2015 to 2018, you were Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, and have played a number of roles as a senior analyst in the U.S. government. And so thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you. David Kramer, also, thank you so much as well. David is joined Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs as a senior fellow, and in May of 2017. But before that, has held senior roles both in the U.S. government, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, responsible for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, Moldova, and that region. David has also held senior leadership positions at a number of institutions, also has been part of the GMF family. So we really, always great to see David and have you join. And last but not least, but you're a big Boston, you're from Boston like myself. So I feel like there's a lot of camaraderie between all of us when it comes to that. But let's jump into this conversation. I think that Michał really sort of laid out quite well, and I'm going to send it back over to him to kind of kick off some of these questions. And I know we would urge those that have joined, there's a Q&A function. You guys all know it by now after a year plus of virtual events. Please begin to pose those questions, and we'll pick up on that as we go along. So, Michał, back to you in Warsaw to kick us off for the first question.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And Andrea, let's start with you. I mean, we really want to start at this, 50,000 feet, 12 kilometers level question. Is this the right timing for the meeting with President Putin, between President Biden and President Putin? All the previous meetings are strongly focused on reassuring allies, on meeting with allies, and there is the odd one at the end with Putin. And then what do you expect to be for the agenda to be, and what would you expect for the outcome of the meeting to be? Andrea, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Michael. So yes, an exciting time in transatlantic relations. I guess I would say that I do think that this was the right time for a meeting. And I say that also kind of recognizing or hearkening back to when the summit was initially proposed by the Biden administration. You'll remember it's when the troops were amassing in and around Ukraine. And I do think with the announcement at that time, it obviously caught most of us, I would probably say all of us, very much off guard. But I do think it was successful in that moment too, in lowering temperatures. And I think from the Biden administration, and I think this is emblematic of their larger approach to Russia, they don't want things to blow up with Russia. They don't want to have a problem with Russia that is going to prevent them from executing on their other foreign policy priorities. So I think if you were sitting in the White House, in the early first 100 days of your administration, you're watching this very significant troop buildup on the border. President Biden didn't want that to define his presidency and distract and derail him from executing on his other priorities. So I think their goal at the time was to lower the temperature. I agree it's extremely problematic that there hasn't been really any reciprocal actions, any real interest in the Kremlin. If anything, the ransomware attacks have continued. We saw yesterday that they labeled the Navalny organization as an extremist organization. So it's a pretty tough atmosphere going into the summit. But I think the administration, and again, kind of from their perspective, the goal is to prevent the disruption, to try to manage the situation so they can do all of the other things that they want to do: China, climate, COVID. We hear them talk about those 3 C's. And so I think when going in, the word that I think best summarizes what they're looking to accomplish is basically guardrails. I think they want guardrails in the relationship. So one, it's having this leader-to-leader communication. The administration knows that after 4 years of Trump, those lines of communication were basically eviscerated. And so we've seen them very proactively try to reestablish, obviously, President Putin to President Biden, they've had their phone calls, Blinken to Lavrov, Jake Sullivan to Patrushev through the DoD channel. So they're working very hard. They see the leader-to-leader channel is also important in that. I think second item that they're likely to talk about and what they're looking to accomplish is kind of a more stable diplomatic presence in each other's countries. So we know that we've had, again, and that's a guardrail, right? So that diplomacy can function properly. So trying to bring some end to the tit-for-tat expulsions, the closure of consulates, not being able to issue visas. I think they want diplomacy to be able to function in this relationship. And then I think the third guardrail and what will be the key deliverable of the summit is the arms control and strategic stability agenda, expecting some sort of announcement there. And again, that's a critical guardrail. The administration knows that the risk of this unintended escalation between the two sides, especially in new domains like cyberspace, in the Arctic, wherever it is, that the risk of unintended escalation has gone up, and they want to try to set some guardrails on the relationship. So I think the last thing I will say is, in a way, the ball is now in the Kremlin's court. I mean, so this administration has come in with a very kind of clear-eyed balance between confrontation and some engagement. And if the Kremlin now shows coming out of this summit that they're not interested, then I think that mix of confrontation and engagement is going to start to skew much more heavily towards the confrontation side. So I think in that sense, it is very much in the Kremlin's court after that.
Super, very interesting, Andrea. Thank you very much. So guardrails, early engagement to prevent a blow up, and basically, if I paraphrasing entirely, but Russia being a bit of an afterthought comparing to other priorities with China, COVID, and climate, overstating this. David, over to you. And I would just mention that at some point, David was my office mate, almost. We were just across So, that's a special relationship right there. David, for you, the same question, is it the right timing? What do you expect? And also perhaps, you could start with it and we'll come back to Andrea on this. How do Russians see this? How does Putin see this opening from the US side? Over to you.
Sure. Michał, thanks so much. And to Jonathan and GMF. And of course, it's great to be with Andrea on this discussion, a very important and timely one. I actually don't think the summit is a good idea. I didn't at the time. And I think events since then would suggest that it was not a good idea from day one. I was very heartened to see the rhetoric from then candidate Biden during the campaign and the continued rhetoric and actions in the first 2-3 months of the administration, taking a tough line, imposing 2 rounds of sanctions. The second came just 2 days after the phone call between the president and Putin, and the comments about Putin being a killer. President Biden was asked a direct question, and I think to have answered any other way than the way he did would have been a major mistake, as we saw with the previous president when he was asked the same question. Secretary Blinken's trip to Kiev was very positive. I think the administration has done a number of positive things. I don't think the summit invitation was one of them. And that was followed not too long after the decision to waive sanctions on the Nord Stream AG company involved and on Matthias Warnig, a close ally and friend. And I don't know if you can call someone a Stasi spy, a former Stasi spy, but Matthias Warnig also received a waiver. All that suggests to me that the administration has actually gotten a little wobbly when it comes to dealing with Mr. Putin. I do think that you look at what's happened since the invitation. First, Putin kept Biden waiting for over a month to accept the invitation, which was pretty damn rude, frankly. And in that time, yes, the buildup along the border in illegally occupied Crimea was reduced a bit, but not much. The Russians still have the capability on a very short notice to re-invade Ukraine, and obviously it's happened before. Navalny was also a factor, I think, in the extension of the invitation for a summit. There was great concern at the time in April that Navalny was about to be killed, not simply died, but he would have been killed by Putin and his thugs. Navalny is still alive, of course, and yet, as Andrea said, his organization just yesterday was designated an extremist organization, which puts in legal peril all those who have worked with him, all those who have provided funding and support, more than already has been the case. We've already seen the Russian authorities really crack down in probably the ugliest way we have seen since the breakup of the Soviet Union as they gear up for Duma elections in September. The support for Lukashenko after his, I would say, state act of terrorism when he engaged in air piracy, hijacking a plane to arrest Roman Protasevich. The continued support for Assad. We still have 2 Americans, Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed, in detention in Russia on completely spurious charges. And Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the pressure on them is only increasing. So none of these things has been positive since President Biden extended an invitation. And instead, I think we have seen, particularly when it comes to the hacking and ransomware attacks on the United States, these are major attacks. With the Colonial Pipeline affecting our energy supplies, the JBS company affecting our meat supplies. Basically, if any other country had engaged in this kind of activity, we would view it as an act of war. And yet, instead, the President of the United States is going to Geneva next week to meet with the President of Russia, who I would argue bears ultimate responsibility for all of these things. He has created the environment in which this kind of behavior occurs. And not only does he not go after people who engage in the hacking and ransomware or poisonings, he promotes them. It goes back to Lugovoy in 2006 with Litvinenko's poisoning. Putin doesn't do anything to rein in this activity. So I'm glad the president has invited President Zelensky to the White House next month for a visit. I wish the previous administration had done that. It didn't, obviously, and got into a huge scandal instead. I wish the president were meeting with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the Belarus democracy leader, and send a signal to the people of Belarus that we stand with her and the forces of democracy and freedom, not with that brutal, awful dictatorial leader, Alexander Lukashenko. And I'm heartened by a few of the things the president said, including just yesterday, where he said, we're not seeking conflict with Russia. We want a stable and predictable relationship. But I've been clear the United States will respond in a robust and meaningful way if the Russian government engages in harmful activities. And yet Putin responds by saying if if Ukraine seeks NATO membership, there will be huge problems for Ukraine. I wish the president were going with a different message. Frankly, I wish he were not going to Geneva for this meeting. But if he were, I wish he would say to President Putin, we are going to go after your accounts and those in your circle. We're going to freeze them. We're going to make them inaccessible. Your $1.3 billion palace in Sochi will become uninhabitable. If you engage in another hack against us, if you do anything further to Navalny, if any of these things, any outrageous behavior, you are going to pay a serious price. I hope that's the message the president will deliver. We'll see.
Thank you very much, David, for clear message. Actually, from both of you, very clearly kicking us off for this discussion, and also I like the fact that we have a bit of a debate. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, and those are really both important sort of positions, and I can see the perspectives of both sides, particularly given sort of where this administration in Washington came in after 4 years of real challenges. Obviously, the relationship between Putin and Trump, but also, and I want to, Andrea, too, something that you said, and maybe to pick up on too, a couple of things. One is, the Putin summit is the end of the week, and right now, as Michał pointed out, Biden's already on the ground. How important, I think sometimes maybe lost to this particular meeting is what's happening all the way between today and before this meeting. But how important is it is rebuilding the transatlantic relations and sort of coordination in order to be able to address these challenges? And then also want to ask you too, and David, you can sort of jump in this too, because you've been, the previous 4 years, you were writing about these very same things, about the erosion of the transatlantic community, NATO, the inability of the previous president to articulate support for Article 5. I mean, I think maybe we take it all for granted that, sort of we're just back in the swing of things. But I wanted, Andrea, to ask you about that, about where you think that stands, David, you too, but also China. And Andrea, you've spent a lot of time with other colleagues writing about Russia and China, about strategy. And I don't think, and I understand, and we've gotten some questions already about, sort of U.S. strategy or concessions in order to, and some believe that there's an opportunity to peel Russia away. I have to be, I'm very skeptical. I think others are about that, but of, what are the areas where, I forget about climate change, I know is critical, important, and, I'm skeptical about anything that Putin does or says in terms of his commitments, but maybe you could speak a little bit about China and what maybe the strategy is and how that fits in. Because I think if you're sitting in the National Security Council in Washington and you're Jake Sullivan, you're thinking you've got the globe and you've got U.S. domestic challenges and you've got how it, what's happening globally, and you're thinking, a couple of steps ahead down the road. And David, I want to bring you into on the China piece too, because I think this is something that you've been both thinking about and talking about as well. So Andrea, can I just turn that over to you? Maybe
Jonathan.
just yeah.
I was gonna say, you just put a tremendous amount on the table. So maybe we can save China for 1 second and do the allies piece first. And sure. I know obviously David's gonna have comments on both. He just wrote a great piece on Russia, China too. So, but I want, before we do allies and the importance of transatlantic relations, I also just want to make the quick point that I'm not sure there's that much disagreement or different views between David and I. I would agree with almost everything that David said up to the point that except I think that we should meet with Putin. I entirely agree with his kind of characterization of the Kremlin and what it is and what it's doing. Maybe the only point of contention I would have is on the Nord Stream 2 side, which I view as much more of a transatlantic issue than a Russia issue. And, you know, with the administration viewing Nord Stream 2 and the waivers as is entirely, and this will get me to the transatlantic piece, about prioritizing the transatlantic relationship and recognizing the very important role that Germany plays in helping us accomplish a lot of the other things that the Biden administration wants to do, especially China. So I think that decision was made not as a concession to Russia, not because they were being soft on Russia, but because they prioritized restoring a very, very damaged relationship with Berlin after 4 years under the Trump administration. And there's also nothing to say that the waivers can't be removed, right? They created that, again, strategic space for dialogue with Germany. Germany has sent their negotiators, and now the ball's in Germany's court to put something on the table to mitigate, to lessen all the things that we all hate and dislike about the pipeline. So that was maybe the only thing that David said that I really disagreed with. And then other than I think they should meet. And so, but to your point about allies, I mean, obviously this administration has said all of the right things about the importance of allies and is going into the meeting with Putin, having had all of those important meetings with allies first. I think that stems in part from, well, I mean, that is the key message of the G7 and the NATO summit and the EU summit is very much about the United States is back, alliances matter, unity matters. There's going to be tremendous effort in trying to, you know, I think Jake Sullivan put out a tweet or something that talking about the goal of the summits, you know, it's a very modest expectation, but would like to rally the world's democracies to address today's challenges. So they are, I think, very focused on trying to rebuild alliances. I think I saw this morning, one of the outcomes of the U.S. EU summit is agreeing to start a discussion process with the European Union on Russia, more coordination. So this is a central pillar of the Biden administration's approach to Russia, something that is obviously very different than the previous administration. They see unity and cohesion with allies as critical in addressing the Kremlin. And I think that stems in part because they recognize that changing President Putin's calculus is very difficult, right? And so that Putin isn't really going to change course after 20 years in power. He has firmly entrenched ideas about the United States, and that confrontation with the US is ingrained into his mentality. So the United States is looking to kind of build a coalition that can more effectively push back against that. And it's also looking then to strengthen resilience. And so I think that's another key pillar, and that'll be a key theme with the allies, is if we can't entirely change Putin's calculus, then we need to be working as a collection of democracies to try to increase our ability to reduce the effects of those tactics, right? And, you know, David mentioned he hopes the president goes in with those hard messages about freezing assets and anti-corruption. We've seen this administration raise that as an important issue with the new executive order. So those two pillars, the allies and resilience, I think are a key focus of the way this administration is going in, and is, you know, hopefully will improve our ability to navigate the Kremlin more, and that we can do it more effectively.
If you want me to jump in, I'll just say that, look, the Biden administration inherited a transatlantic relationship that was in tatters. It didn't just start, by the way, under the Trump administration. Of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 during the administration in which I served caused real friction in the transatlantic relationship. The pivot to Asia and the Obama administration didn't help. And then it seemed like President Trump took a blowtorch to the relationship, and particularly toward Germany. So there is a lot of repair work to be done. However, that said, the Europeans should not think that this is a one-way street. There have been actions and behavior on the European side that are pretty problematic, not just dealing with Nord Stream 2 and Russia. The rush to get the free trade or the investment agreement done with China at the end of last year, which the European Parliament has now held up, was not a good thing, particularly knowing that the Biden administration was going to come in with China as a priority. So there need to be some actions taken on the European side to meet us so that it is a two-way street, not just a one-way street where the Europeans are expecting we will fix everything. That said, on Nord Stream 2, I'm deeply uncomfortable that the United States is in a position where we feel we need to sanction a close ally like Germany. But Germany is making an enormous mistake with this pipeline. If its failure to understand that the transit of gas through Ukraine provides Ukraine some leverage and a way to hold off yet another massive invasion by Russia that could affect the capital, the entire country, and possibly destroy the pipeline, Russia won't care if Nord Stream 2 is open about destroying the pipeline that runs through Ukraine. Ukraine also gets sizable income and transit fees from this pipeline. And unless Germany is prepared to pay $2 to $3 billion a year to Ukraine, then it really should stop. And I was disappointed in Secretary Blinken's comment saying that the pipeline is now a fait accompli. Last I checked, unless a pipeline is 100% complete, a pipeline is not done. You can't send gas through a pipeline that's 95, 96% complete, because guess what? It won't get to the destination. And so it is not too late for the United States to intervene and try to stop this. It is, as much as I don't like seeing this kind of confrontation between allies, we need to be focused on where the real source of the threat and problems are. And that is in Moscow, and it comes from Mr. Putin. The last thing I would say is the administration keeps using the phrase predictability and stability, seeking that in the relationship. Let me predict this. There will not be stability in this relationship as long as Mr. Putin is in power. He thrives on creating instability. He thrives on destabilizing his neighbors. He wants to make Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova and Belarus and all the other countries unappealing to the West so that the West loses interest in these countries and might not be willing to accept them into Euro-Atlantic institutions. It reminds me of the win-win phrase that was heard during the reset time of the Obama administration. Putin doesn't think in win-win terms. He thinks in zero-sum terms, and he doesn't like stability, prefers instability, unless predictability and stability mean he is safe in power, and so are his ill-gotten billions.
Can I just, Michał, can I bring you into just this predictability and stability that David just brought up? I'm mindful that sometimes that there's this focus on Berlin and maybe Paris or Brussels as the interlocutors, London, but from Warsaw, I'm curious. And you have the small challenge of speaking for all of Europe right now, which is it's just tough to do on any day. But how does that look? Because sometimes I think this messaging on Russia is more about how allies might view or be comfortable with certain language versus what the actual outcome of the U.S. Russia relationship. Because I agree with David. Anything about this, if over the last 2 decades, that there's no predictability to this. But is this more about messaging to allies? And what's the view? And I'm sorry to turn to you, but I know part of even our early discussions about this conversation today was about how the views were coming out from Warsaw and from other capitals in Central and Eastern Europe, which you said were concerned. So can I just ask you that question? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I think it's important.
No, thank you very much, Jonathan, and I'm happy to switch the hats tiny bit. When I have conversations around Warsaw, that the goal of the meeting is predictability and stability, people keep pointing out exactly what David said, that what Putin wants is instability and unpredictability, and this is how he was acting. So that's that's where a question of what will it take, what would be the price that the US is willing to pay for this comes in, and this is where the nervousness comes from. But there is also a second issue, and and we've been talking about this Nord Stream 2 waiver, and it really is becoming a symbol a little bit. But let me bite a little bit deeper into it, because President Biden made clear, and Andrea, I think you explained it very well. This was a decision vis-a-vis Germany in order not to sanction a close ally. But what was not mentioned in any way is that it came also at an expense of interests of other allies, including Poland, but also Ukraine, but Poland being a NATO ally that sees Nord Stream 2 as hitting on its vital national interest. And to add insult to injury, so to say, it came as a total surprise. It came without any consultations. And even though I understand the thinking from Washington perspective, I see a big problem with the way it was done, and it now brings it puts this weird cliche of sort of early mistakes that were done in the Obama administration on this administration. And I think it's something that really needs to be frankly fixed. And it can be fixed by conversation and then tough negotiation on exactly what you said. Given that there is a waiver, what will Germany do vis-a-vis not only United States, but actually also the region, not to make Nord Stream 2 the political and economic weapon that Russia might want to use it. So I think that's, and we are just not having this conversation so far. So big, for people that are listening, do talk, give us a call. Not me, others. I mean, anyways, I'll stop here. Because there are lots of reasons why those phone calls are not happening. This is not the best time in Polish domestic politics, but these are national interests that are now being very much in play. I'll stop.
Yeah, and I think that diplomatic engagement could be an area of improvement because I've heard this in a lot of spaces about not getting these types of heads up. Maybe even the Zelensky thing, which has, in the recent conversation, the invitation, which I think is all important. There seemed to be, whether it was on Kiev's side or Washington, hopefully that will strengthen, give the administration a little bit of a break, since it's 4 months in coming in the manner at which it did. It's still getting its key people in positions right now, still to this moment, still trying to get them in, which is important. And I often think of predictability and stability. Maybe it's more of the U.S. message to our allies about the U.S. And about U.S. foreign policy and direction. And so there's lots of messaging. If I could, if Andrea or David, if you wanted to respond to Michal's statement, you can, and then we're happy to, Andrea, you're right. I laid on several big issues at once, which is a bad form for these types of conversations. But I did want to get to China, and then I'll send it back to Warsaw for follow-up questions. But does anybody want to respond to what Michał said?
I think those are very fair and reasonable points that Michał just made. And I just to reiterate, I think, Jonathan, what you said, and again, like kind of from the administration's perspective, not having the full team in place. I mean, it's unfortunately taking them a long time to get everyone into seats. We don't have our assistant secretary, we don't have our ambassadors. And I think that's unfortunately kind of the fallout from being in that kind of position. So very fair points. But the one point I would just make is, we are hearing kind of regularly the fear that the Biden administration is kind of quote unquote sleepwalking into a reset, right? So we hear that a lot. It's the Nord Stream 2 and the summit and the difference in the way this administration is approaching Russia compared to the way they're dealing with China. But I think it's also important just to set, put into context, and I can agree that phrase of stable and predictable relationship is maybe a little bit unfortunate, but when you actually think about what they want to accomplish with the Kremlin, it's incredibly limited. They're not talking about improving the relationship in any substantive way. They're not talking about embarking on cooperation in expansive areas. I mean, you can count on one hand where there is interest in engaging the Kremlin. It's arms control and strategic stability. It's Afghanistan. It's the JCPOA. possibly the Arctic, and maybe the climate, and that's really it. Like, I would be hard pressed to think that they think that they're going to deal with the Kremlin in any areas outside of that. And even on the JCPOA and Afghanistan, it's pretty limited. It's not like they're embarking on cooperation, but just recognizing that the Kremlin has the ability to make harder what it is they're trying to achieve. And it's better, at least if there's some coordination on those issues. So they're not looking to warm relations. They're not looking to improve relations. And so I think, as we're hearing these concerns about potential reset or where this is headed, I'm not sure how, I guess that's not the way I see it. And, David raised the point too, that they issued the sanctions, just 2 days after the Putin phone call. I think this administration is entirely comfortable confronting and trying to engage at the same time. And I don't see them kind of taking the foot, and I don't think that they actually think, because the areas of cooperation are so narrow, and they're in areas where I think Russia too wants to engage with the United States. I don't think that they believe that the confrontation and the raising the costs for Russia's bad actions is going to poison the areas where they want to engage. So they're going to be very comfortable doing both of those things and coming out of the summit. I think if there's no kind of signs of people, it takes two to tango, we all get that. If Putin's not interested in dancing, then again, that mix between the two will start to skew more heavily towards the confrontation side. So I hope people don't think it's like the sleepwalking into a reset, because I don't think that's what's happening.
David?
Well, first, let me just quickly say that I can't think of a better person who has been nominated to be the Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs than Karen Donfried. So as soon as she can get a hearing and confirmed, I think the better off we all will be.
We agree.
I assumed you would. Let me touch on China quickly. I think Andrea and I would agree, it would be a fool's errand to think that we can lure Russia away from China. Neither Russia nor China, I think, is interested in playing each other off of us. They want to keep their options open. They are sort of in a marriage of convenience because they don't like the pressure and sanctions in the case of Russia, and even in the case of China for what's happened with the Uyghurs. And yet that relationship, I don't think, is as close as some may view it. Russia, in my view, should look at China and see it as the biggest threat it faces in the future, not the United States, not NATO, not the European Union. The most stable borders Russia has are with countries that are in NATO and or the European Union. The most unstable borders are in the Central Asian part and in the Far East. And if I look at the population numbers along the Russian-Chinese border and east of the Urals, I would be nervous if I were sitting in Moscow too, and I would be careful about the kind of weapon systems I sold to the Chinese as well. And I do think that there is growing nervousness among some in Moscow about the development of the relationship between Beijing and Moscow. But we're not going to we're not going to succeed in bringing Putin over to our side to team up against the China challenge, nor are we going to win over Xi to deal with Putin, in my view. We need to recognize that both are huge challenges and threats, and we need to respond accordingly.
Thank you very much, David. We actually, so let me ask this same question to Andrea, because we are sort of, you haven't had a chance, you were nodding, and I would encourage everyone online to ask questions through Q&A. We'll get to you, the panelists and Jonathan and I. So Andrea, to you for the question about this pulling Russia away from China aspect.
I think David, we pretty much agree, although I probably view that relationship as deepening in a more significant way slightly than David. But we definitely agree that it is a fool's errand to try to peel Russia away from China. David said Russia should look at China as the bigger threat. I totally agree, and yet they don't, right? And so I think that's something for the United States to be able to play on and chip away at, because I also agree with David that there are people in Moscow who are probably getting a little bit nervous about Russia's growing subservience to China. And so we have to keep, in public and in private, keep showing all of the ways that China is eating Russia's lunch, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's inroads to Ukraine and Belarus. They have new deals with Iran. I mean, in all of these places that Russia views as important to its own national interest, China is making inroads. And so we should be, again, in public and in private, sending that message very regularly to the Kremlin. And so what is the approach if we can't kind of peel one away from the other? I guess I think of it as at least trying to convince Russia that some cooperation, and again, at the moment, the ground for that is extremely limited, but that some cooperation with the United States is possible and preferable to its growing subservience to China. And again, ground for doing that is narrow. Maybe it's in the Arctic. So we are probably in agreement with Russia that we don't want China to play a significant role in Arctic governance. I mean, there's some areas where we can at least start building the foundation for cooperation or engagement that could grow over time. And so in my mind, it's very incremental. And I don't see under Putin it changing significantly because he seems to be marching out on this course, irrespective of whether or not it might not be in Russia's national interest. If Putin was really concerned about China, I don't think he would be burning roads with the burning bridges with the European Union. He might be trying harder to maintain a healthy relationship with India, Japan. I mean, there are really important ways that Russia could be hedging, and I don't quite see that the way that you would expect if he was actually that concerned about China. So in my view, it's about kind of incremental approaches to convince Russia to pursue a more balanced foreign policy, right? That's all what we don't want is a Russia that's all in with China. What we don't want is a Russia that is selling these increasingly sophisticated weapon systems to China, that's making China a more aggressive, a more significant military threat. We don't want Russia to act in ways, whether it's in India, or other places, acting in ways that are actually not in Russia's interests and that are supporting and towing the line with Beijing. That's what we don't want. And so if we can get a Russia that's pursuing just a more balanced foreign policy, I think that's the goal. And that's been like the ethos of Russian foreign policy for a very long time, right? A multipolar world order where Russia is an unaligned pole. And so we need to be doing things that can to shape their calculus that is indeed the way. And I think planting the seeds, like David was saying, with people around Putin, so that maybe post-Putin that course can change more significantly, because I think it's unlikely under Putin.
Yeah, I think that this is such an important topic given the focus. But I wanted to one of the questions we had, and I think that came in. And David, I haven't heard what you think, and maybe this is. Andrea laid out some of the areas where there might be room for cooperation, areas like the Arctic, or when we look at things like Afghanistan, JCPOA, or climate, arms control, clearly is significant. Do you think that there's any room, I know it's hard for you to, you've made the argument that it's unlikely that there's going to be much progress made, but do you think that there is possibility in any of these spaces? And I think this is, one of the comments was about whether, what are the realistic outcomes of the summit, and maybe, what does it look like on, the day after, and sort of going ahead in some of these areas. And if you have, obviously we can come back to China because it's so significant, but I did want to ask both of you, David, I think you mentioned sort of engaging Putin, but what about engagement with Russians? And Andrea, you mentioned the Navalny situation. I mean, there's so much happening on the ground, so much squeezing of civil society, media. There's an election this year, but this is far from a free and fair or transparent election. Maybe you could just also maybe some thoughts too, because the president has been talking a lot about human rights, democracy, and maybe speak to those issues as well. So I'm sorry, I'm laying a lot on both of you. David, maybe summit outcomes as a response to what Andrea said could possibly be that case, maybe, and then Andrea, going to you about what does the U.S. do about Russians, because the situation is so bad that I see a lot of writing on this that sort of harkens back to some very dark days, for the Russian people, and they really are one of the main victims here. So, David, over to you on summit outcomes, and you can also weigh in, if you want to, on
Sure.
engaged Russians.
So let's remember that President Biden, in his first week in office, got the extension of the New START agreement done. He did that over the phone with President Putin. He didn't have to meet with him. And that was something that had been worked on in the previous administration, continued into the first few days of the Biden administration, and they got it done. And that is a reminder, I think, that these leaders actually don't have to sit in the same city in the same meeting in order to get some of these top priority issues accomplished. I'm not optimistic that there will be much else that will come out of this meeting. I think, for example, we don't know if there will be a joint statement issued between these two leaders. I understand that there's been one worked on, but not yet clear whether one will be issued. There apparently there are plans for a joint press conference. I think President Biden needs to be prepared for a question that will ask him, do you think the man standing or sitting next to you is a killer? And I hope he's ready to give the right answer on that. And that may set Putin off onto a long tirade, depending on whether President Biden answers correctly. And I think on JCPOA, there has been work together between the two sides. I think there's likely to be. That was obviously an issue where the previous American administration and the Russian government didn't see eye to eye. On the Arctic, it seems that the Russians are ahead of us. They have a major advantage when it comes to dealing with the Arctic, but trying to reduce confrontation in the Arctic seems important. Hopefully we can agree on that. But let's also remember, this is a government where at least Russia is the source. Let me put it this way. Russia is the source of hacks that have included American hospitals and medical institutions during a pandemic, that included a major pipeline, that included the largest meat processing facilities in the United States. These are not acts of a friendly government. These are actually hostile acts. And I think we should really rein in our expectations on what might come out of this summit and think that from June 16th in Geneva, we'll then see a whole flurry of activity on U.S. Russian relations. The American ambassador is still not returned to Moscow. The Russian ambassador is not back in Washington either. And yet when they go back, we'll have ambassadors in both countries. We have significantly reduced embassies, and in the Russian case, most because there is our spies and agents, but our embassy has been significantly cut back, affecting even visa applications and diplomatic or the citizen-to-citizen exchange. We really do need to figure out how we can get messaging to the Russian people. Our problem is not with the Russian people. Our problem is with the Putin regime, and I deliberately use the term regime, and his circle. And we need to get much tougher with us. Last thing I'd say, and then over to Andrea, we need to clean up our own house. And there's legislation now that I think will help us in this regard. As much as Putin and his cronies bash us, they look to Western financial institutions, Western real estate as safe places to stash their ill-gotten gains. We need to do a hell of a lot better job in cleaning that up, cutting off these outlets for this illicit funds, in which case the incentive for accumulating them might decline. So we can do a great job of stop enabling corrupt Russian behavior. In the city I live in, Miami, again, to be clear, not all Russian money here is bad, but there's some of it is. And New York and Londongrad is called that for a reason. So in the West, we need to do a lot better job of cleaning up our own house. And that, in the end, will help the people of Russia.
Do you want me to jump in, Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And so I think David hit a lot on the democracy and human rights front, but I'll say a little bit more after. The one area where I do think that, we will see a deliverable or some sort of announcement is on that arms control and strategic stability front. I think both governments going in, getting back to that idea of guardrails It is just as much in Putin's interest to embark on discussions with the United States in that domain. And obviously, this is one area where Putin likes to be seen sitting down with the United States, right? The two world nuclear powers sitting down. It's where he views he's on par with the United States. But at the same time, they also have concerns that the strategic stability between our two countries has diminished, right? So with the advent of all the new weapons systems in space and in cyber, there is now really the potential that you could have low-level incidents that very significant, quickly escalate into something more serious. And so that is one area where the Russians also see it in their interest. It's in our interest, it's in their interest to sit down and start having some of these discussions. It's really unlikely that we'll get to a major arms control agreement anytime soon. The climate in the United States is not ripe for that, but probably more importantly, that is because Russia doesn't adhere to the agreements it signs, right? So it violates the INF, open skies, all of these things. So I don't think the ground is fertile for any real arms control agreement, but I do think some of these things that fall more under the strategic stability basket. So rules in the cyber domain, not attacking each other's command and control using cyber weapons, things in space. There's low-level confidence building measures, transparency measures, unilateral measures, things that the United States and Russia could do, I think, to at least introduce more stability into the relationship in that way. And hopefully, we only have 5 years now with the New START, hopefully build to something where we can get a follow-on agreement within that time frame. And so that's the one area. I mean, I think that's how the administration sees it. Arms control and strategic stability will be the anchor of the relationship. That's the one area. And then to get on the democracy and human rights front, you're absolutely right that this is something that President Biden views as critical in addressing the Russians. He said in his Memorial Day speech that he would raise democracy and human rights with Putin at the summit. So we can expect that. We can expect those messages. And then I think they are looking for creative ways to engage with Russians because they are interested in at least planting the seeds for a better relationship. And this is one area where I would underscore how important it is to do it with the Europeans. If we could better coordinate efforts, there's obviously tons going on, Poland, Lithuania, all of these places where there are kind of activities going on to support Russians and Russian civil society. If we could align efforts in a more focused way, I think it would make them more effective. And David talked about young Russians, which I think is so important. There's been some good research that came out, showing that young Russians who travel abroad and who speak other languages have much more negative views of Putin. And so getting visas on track, yet letting young Russians travel to the United States. We're obviously not going to liberalize our visa situation, but is there a way to fast track visas for university age Russian students so that they can come to the United States? So I think keeping those links as open as possible. Messaging David mentioned is really important, going to Russians where they are, if it's on YouTube or in some other places. And I recognize that's getting harder and harder by the day as the Kremlin is cracking down even online. But all of those things, and then also the anti-corruption stuff. So, being able to pursue along with Europe some of the anti-corruption measures that prevents the Kremlin from spreading corruption and increasing its influence beyond its borders. Those are all really important. And then I won't repeat what David said because I agree with it, but our own house in order in revitalizing our own democracy. So there's a lot of work there, I think, and there's a huge amount of room to do better on the alignment between the United States and Europe on that issue in particular.
And Jonathan, can I just quickly throw in one other item, everything that Andrea just said. Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty is this close to being forced out of the country. The Putin regime needs to pay a huge price for that, in my view. And I'll leave it for others to discuss what that might be for another time. That's a whole different or related discussion. But what the Russian government has been doing to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is truly outrageous. And there needs to be a price to be paid for that.
Yeah, and I know the administration has been weighing in on that, and that's important. I think also what Andrea said too about, I think that U.S. Whether it's Google or YouTube or others are also being squeezed as well, along with Russian media. I call it sort of a new, this curtain that comes down on Russians. And I hope that we don't see, like we're seeing now, even in Belarus, sort of a closing of borders and travel to, and not allowing this to happen. And I think that's, when we talk to Russians who are at the sharp end of the stick about how difficult it has become for many Russians to do these things. Michał, can I just turn it back to you to Warsaw, because I know we're closing in on our hour with not enough time to get through all these issues, but just for you for final questions and thoughts, and I'll send it over.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Well, we had lots of very good questions at Q&A. We didn't get to all of them, but one of them, and perhaps we haven't discussed it much, but we literally have 3-4 minutes, is what does Putin want from this summit besides the PR aspect, which is, well, PR aspect, well, the respect aspect that he gets from it. So what is in their mind that you can see, and and if you can maybe in the last 2 minutes for both of you, Andrea, starting with you. Yeah, we are a few days before their first meeting, but if you can imagine a trajectory of U.S. Russia relationship under this administration, those choose, pick and choose, and take it as your closing words as well. Over to you, Andrea.
All right, so going in, I think President Putin is coming in looking to vilify the United States, to look like a strong leader who's standing up for Russian interests, to demonstrate to his onlookers wherever it is around the globe who might admire his style of governance that he's willing to stand up to the United States. So I would expect if they have a press conference, I think it'll be prickly. I think both of them are coming in knowing that they have to look strong. But I do think that it will be, I don't know, tempered by at least some strand of pragmatism, because I really don't think that either leader wants to turn it all the way up, right? So we know the Biden administration doesn't want this to escalate, but I also don't think that Putin wants it to get too much worse. I think they're pretty happy where they are. And so there will be some kind of element of pragmatism, especially to get to the arms control and strategic stability announcement that I really think Putin wants. So, I think coming in, that's where it's important for him that he looks strong, making the United States be a villain, anti-US sentiment. That's a really important pillar of his domestic standing. And so he can't not do that. And I wish I could say something optimistic about where I think U.S.-Russia relations are going, but I can't. And I actually think after the summit, if there's not some sort of gesture or effort from the Kremlin, then I think it's just going to kind of deteriorate from here.
Thank you. David.
I think Putin has to be smiling, because the Russian behavior over the past, wherever you want to date it from, let's say from the invasion of Ukraine, you could go back to 2008, the invasion of Georgia, the recent hacking and ransomware attacks, all of this, the continued tensions with Ukraine, pressure on Ukraine, threats to Ukraine, and the support for Lukashenko. And here, the president of the Russian Federation is going to sit down with the president of the United States in Geneva. The isolation that President Obama bragged about in his State of the Union speech in January 2015 is long gone. It was in the Obama administration. It certainly was in the Trump administration. Putin is not isolated. He is now meeting with the president of the United States, and that has to make him very happy, I'm afraid to say. I think Senator Menendez was absolutely right yesterday in his speech on the Senate floor when he said, we're dealing with a mafia state run by a vicious authoritarian and his inner circle of corrupt oligarchs, not a normal country. And I would say, remember President Biden, when he was vice president in 2011, said he met with Putin and said, I'm looking into your eyes and I don't think you have a soul. And he claims that Putin responded and said, we understand one another. I hope President Biden, meeting now with President Putin, because he was vice president and Putin was prime minister at the time, makes it clear to Putin that the gloves are coming off, that we have had enough. It's time to go after Putin and his circle and their money and their assets. If they continue this kind of behavior, some would argue we should already be doing it. I think we're in for a very difficult, tense relationship. I'm not saying we should never meet with the Russians. There are things, as Andrea has outlined, that we have to deal with them on. But this is a rogue regime, and I think it needs to be treated accordingly.
David, Andrea, Jonathan, thank you so much for truly a fascinating conversation, wealth of thoughts. I'm sure, I mean, we had lots of people listening, but I'm sure it will reverberate. And, you know, best of luck, frankly, for the two of you for the upcoming week, which is going to be very busy. It's going to be busy for everyone, I suspect. We at GMF, I'm going to do a little GMF plug, are also going to host Brussels Forum next week, including the NATO 2030 conference, where we'll be watching all these developments, first in Brussels, both NATO and EU summits, and then in Geneva very, very closely. So, and fingers crossed for our good allies in Washington. It's been a great pleasure to work between Warsaw and DC, and we very much will be watching carefully what comes out from the meeting in Geneva. Thank you all joining us online. Stay healthy, stay safe, and see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrea and David. Thank you.
A lot.
Take care.